Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Teenagers on Lockdown, the podcast. We're here with you today with our hosts, Amber Stainton, Lily Fishman, and our newest host, Mason Leffler. To our hosts, over to you.
So today, I believe we're going to start by discussing a little about climate change and global warming and how people are sort of reacting to that, and our thoughts on how many movements have started because of the lack of action by many governments to tackle climate change and tackle it at its root sources. Do any of you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I am an organizer with Fridays for Future, which is the movement that was started by Greta Thunberg. So obviously I think that it's quite a big issue, the climate crisis. And I definitely, there's not enough people taking it seriously right now, especially in America, because our government's removing so many restrictions on carbon emissions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I also think that the fundamental roots of climate change and global warming are much less based in, what individuals can do, or rather what individuals have done, but rather based on large corporations that are going unchecked by the government. And I think that, especially right now in the United States, when we have movements for the Black Lives Matter movement really being expanded right now, I think that other issues such as global warming are sort of not being drowned out, but they're not the headlines anymore. Usually those climate strikes are what are making headlines, and now everything is regarding race relations, and I think that that's something sort of interesting to consider, that although these issues are interrelated, because climate change does disproportionately affect people of lower socioeconomic status, they're being treated as two separate issues. So I think that that's just something to consider.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand how intersectional the climate movement is, because women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Minorities are disproportionately impacted, so that's BIPOC folks. People with disabilities are disproportionately impacted. So a lot of climate organizers and movements right now are actually switching their focus to be more on kind of racial justice. And I know my climate group has done a lot for Black Lives Matter recently, and for Indigenous peoples where I'm from. So there's been a big shift onto supporting BIPOC issues right now, rather than doing our normal climate justice stuff.
Yeah, so I live in a very segregated city, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It is the number one most segregated city in the United States. And from my experience with people of color and the discrimination that goes on against them, it has been linked to some of the major causes of pollution, global warming, and environmental destruction. If you think, I'm going to go to Flint, Michigan, there's the lead is in water right there, and that's both a race issue and it's an environmental issue, and those are very, very inextricably connected. There is no, in my opinion, this crisis wouldn't be as big as it is if there had been different demographics that had been affected.
What actions do you think are being taken by these groups such as Friday for Futures and Extinction Rebellion to make a positive impact on the environment?
Well, definitely. I know that Fridays for Future, we do a lot of awareness campaigns, just because so many people don't realize how widespread this is, that there's already people that are dying from this. And a lot of people don't realize how intersectional it is. I know many, many people don't understand that minorities are disproportionately impacted. So definitely the awareness. I know that a lot of groups do a lot of lobbying efforts, not as much FFF. I think Earth Uprising did a lot of that, I'm pretty sure. USYCS might do some of that in the US. And then Extinction Rebellion does all their big protests and sit-ins and stuff that's vaguely illegal, which I totally support. I can get behind that. I would not personally do it, but all the power to them. I think that it's great that they're drawing attention to what's happening.
Because if you don't do something radical, then people won't take notice.
Yes, for sure.
Do you not feel that perhaps Extinction Rebellion is alienating people from the climate movement by taking these radical actions?
I don't think that they've alienated people. I've called with some people from Extinction Rebellion before as part of something with Fridays for Future where we were working together. And they really do understand that what they do is not what everyone is comfortable with. So if they're very, very accepting of the facts that not everyone will want to participate in what they're doing, and they do work to help make sure that there are other options other than stuff that's illegal. So yeah.
I think that there could be a little bit of a rift created within the climate movement if there are steps that are being taken that are way too over the line. I'd say that people that are, or movements that are more moderate, that take slower and smaller steps to create change, I think those would be a bit more put off by groups with more, not extremist, but more radical means of paying attention to the issue.
You have to be radical enough for people to take notice, but not so extreme that people find that the way of achieving the end result is inhumane.
The only examples I've seen of other groups having issues with stuff that XR is doing would be groups that might be known for being a little more discriminatory. Not going to name names because we're all buddy-buddy in the climate world. But anyone who's a climate organizer knows that some climate groups have a bit of a checkered past with being inclusive of minorities. And the only people that I've seen have an issue with XR are the groups and the people that are involved in kind of more discriminatory practices. It almost sounds backwards because you would think that because getting arrested, you need to have a privilege because BIPOC folks probably aren't as comfortable getting arrested as a white person because of the systemic racism in America. But a lot of people recognize that you can kind of use your privilege that way. And it's really the people who are more discriminatory that kind of want to shut others out of the movement are the people that I've seen take an issue with that.
I know that here in the UK, the government dubbed Extinction Rebellion as a terrorist group. So over here, the government thought a completely different opinion to yours. What do you think about that?
So my question to you is, do you think that Extinction Rebellion has found that sweet spot between taking large enough steps and not being too extremist?
So I definitely don't consider them to be a terrorist group. From what I've seen in, at least where I live, I haven't seen anything that I would say would be too extremist. What about you, Amber? What have you seen?
Well, I know that one group here near me, they dug up some sacred ground and they were very disrespectful to universities around us. But I don't think they deserve to be dubbed a terrorist group because of that.
What are your views on Greta Thunberg? Do you think she's actually helping push the climate movement along? Or do you think she's just a figure for show who's all bark and not really any bite?
Greta's a very sweet girl. I've heard great things about her, but she's not the leader of our movement. And I think all the media attention on Greta does distract from all the amazing folks that are pushing forward the climate movement, especially since Fridays for Future has a bit of a reputation with not being inclusive of the global South, and certain chapters of Fridays for Future are known for having some issues with particularly women and BIPOC folks and people who are not Christian. So I think that it's really important to showcase activists who are not just white girls from Europe, just because there's so many people who are doing so many great things for the movement that we could be uplifting their voices, but there's just so much focus on Greta.
Yeah, I think it's good that someone of our generation is getting recognised, but like you said, she can be a bit overrated and she isn't the leader of the movement. So people should understand that she isn't the one person that started to protest for climate change.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that as well, as good of a voice as she is, as beneficial as she can be, I don't know how effective it'll be in influencing a bunch of governments to take significant actions that'll help mitigate the effects of climate change and prevent it from getting worse. That's really my main concern with her and like all the movements that have begun around her.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to talk about because it's kind of the goals of the different groups that exist. Because yes, all groups want governmental change and we want to see action taken, but it's not. FFF definitely is more of an awareness group versus other places that are kind of more actively putting pressure on governments. And it does vary by local group. Some FFF chapters are very good about putting pressure on the government. For example, I know in the United States, a lot of chapters are talking about police reforms and police abolition or defunding. So that's always good to see that there are groups that are doing that, but that's not always the main goal.
We need to bring awareness to the issue and that it's happening now, not 20 years into the future.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of debate right now in the United States about the police. So a lot of people recognize that the racism in America is systemic, which means that the system is inherently racist. And there's a lot of debate about how to deal with that because some people think that we can reform the system. And those people basically say that, yes, the system is racist, but we can do things to counter that. We can give police more training. We can do all these different things. I personally don't agree with that because I think that the institution itself, it was built on slavery. America as a country was built on slavery. And just the institution is so inherently racist. It started as like slave patrol. So I don't think that reforms are the right way to go. Some people believe in defunding, which would be taking money away from the police, especially like police departments that might be way overfunded and end up being like militarized. So taking that money away and giving it back to the community. So like mental health services, drug counseling, things that would lower the crime rate. And I personally think that would be great. However, I'm an abolitionist, so that would be getting rid of the current system and replacing it with something better that wouldn't be systemically racist would be the goal.
Do you not think that perhaps defunding the police could lead to a rise in crime?
Not if you put the money taken away from the police force into, like you said, prevention of crime. So, of course, there will still be crime because our world isn't a perfect place and we can't completely abolish that. But if we put more money into better education so people wouldn't feel the need to turn to crime for money and instead can get a good job.
Yeah, it's really about putting more money into the community. And by putting money into the community, we will lower the crime rates because things that generally result in people turning to crime would be a lack of a good education. If we put money into education, that won't happen. Addiction, if we put money into mental health counseling, drug services, that won't happen as much. So it's really about focusing on the community versus militarizing the police.
I'd say like the way to solve this and like probably every issue is not to start from the top down, as in start by, reforming the police, but start reforming the communities in which the police are doing these atrocious acts. And like the school to prison pipeline that almost everyone has heard of now is sort of a perpetuation of, well, it's not sort of, it's exactly a perpetuation of the systemic injustices that have, plagued the U.S. And it's not something that we can exactly change superficially. It has to be much more fundamental. And I think that's where many abolitionists are coming from, if I'm not mistaken, Lily, where no amount of change from the top is going to do anything unless we scrap it and restart.
It's about reducing civilian interactions with the police to give them less of a chance to brutalize people, and then about changing the system so that we're not seeing like all these like marijuana laws that are disproportionately seeing men of color arrested, or really any policy that's being used disproportionately. So that's always the idea.
Have either of you heard about the Eat Out Help Out scheme here in the UK that the government has introduced?
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I don't totally understand it.
So the Eat Out Help Out scheme was introduced by the government quite recently to help business owners stay afloat during this time. So it's a £10 off voucher at all participating restaurants to encourage people to dine out more during the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's awesome that the government is kind of helping those restaurants, because I've definitely seen a lot of restaurants around me close.
Yeah, my dad owns restaurants, and we were hit really hard during the pandemic because for 3 months, all we could do was have takeout orders, or curbside carry out is what we call it for marketing purposes. And we were hoping that, it isn't my dad. My dad was hoping that despite the number of cases, we would be able to reopen sooner rather than later because he needed his restaurants to be able to run. And I'd say if we had gone maybe 3 more weeks, our restaurant would have shut down. And so, obviously, encouraging people to go out and eat and, support local businesses is a very good thing, except right after we started reopening, we saw a resurgence in cases. Coincidence there. But it's still something to be said because for the profound economic impact that will always have an effect on, or that will always be affected by any crises or major emergencies that happen throughout the world. And from there, it was really just a matter for our state Supreme Court to decide to reopen. It was a matter of, has it been too long? Will our state be viable as a state if we stay closed? And they just had to reopen everything because even if it meant that more cases would arise.
So how's that working in the UK?
So it has been working for the majority, but some people are criticising the scheme because originally we were going to get a £500 voucher for every citizen so we could spend it on mainly essential items.
Thank you, Lily, Mason and Amber. As we take a short break from the podcast, Alexander Newman recently got the opportunity to catch up with Vincent Song to discuss his life in Hong Kong. Vincent's perspective of Hong Kong is completely different to the one portrayed by Western media, and it was incredibly interesting for Alexander to get the opportunity to catch up with him to discuss the protests, the third wave of the pandemic, and the future of Hong Kong after this pandemic is over. Alexander and Vincent, over to you. Today I'm very pleased to say that I'm here with Vincent Song, one of Teenagers on Lockdown's weekly writers. Vincent lives in Hong Kong, and today we're going to be talking to him about his situation and lifestyle there. Vincent, it's good to have you with us.
Hi, I'm Vincent. I'm speaking from Hong Kong now.
So Vincent, Hong Kong's been a lot in the news lately, and you were telling me earlier that perhaps it's not as bad as people are interpreting it. Do you want to elaborate on that statement and tell us what it's like in Hong Kong at the moment?
Yeah, so obviously there's been a lot on the news about the national security law and everything about Hong Kong losing its liberty and stuff related to that. But honestly, I think what people of my age are generally worrying about now is the third wave of the COVID-19. There's been record-breaking local outbreaks in Hong Kong. And by record-breaking, I mean there's been a lot of new cases lately, and they've all been local. So it's causing quite a bit of concern. So under the face of this, the national security law isn't really that much of a worry. But I suppose it will come back into the spotlight after the pandemic.
So Vincent, you mentioned a third wave. What's being done about that third wave? Because obviously, is there still protesting on the streets in Hong Kong? And is that causing the spreading of the third wave?
Well, no. The government is actually limiting all gatherings to less than 8 or 4 people, I can't remember. So large protests realistically can't take place. And everyone is really afraid in Hong Kong because there's been rumor that there's a new strain of the COVID in Hong Kong, and we're not completely sure, but it's supposed to be more easily transmittable. So yeah, nobody's going on the streets. The protests aren't here anymore. It's not doing anything to transmit the virus. And schools have closed down again. Restaurants have closed after 6, and a lot of different lockdown restrictions have been placed into action again.
Vincent, what do you think sparked this third wave? Because obviously international travel's been shut down across the globe, and I don't know how it's been in Hong Kong, but what do you think caused this third wave of the pandemic?
Yeah, so what you spoke about international travel, I suppose it doesn't completely apply in Hong Kong since Hong Kong hasn't been in lockdown, like Hong Kong hasn't been in complete lockdown, so there's been constant new cases through different people coming into Hong Kong and leaving Hong Kong and stuff like that. But I think the real source of this third strain, this third wave, is due to some potential carriers, perhaps in Hong Kong, who don't show any symptoms, but maybe the virus just mutated and suddenly they're carrying this new strain of the virus all around Hong Kong. We don't really know much about this yet, but that's my mental picture of what's happening.
Okay, thank you very much, Vincent. And Vincent, what do you think is the future for the Hong Kong security law?
So it's very hard to say. I think we would lose a proportion of our freedom of speech, so we can't say anything that might be dangerous to Chinese rule or anything they consider so. And one of the first things that happened after the law came into action was that a Hong Kong organization named Demosisto basically just collapsed. And this organization actually led quite a lot of the original protests in Hong Kong. So I believe there would be pretty much no more protests after the national security law. And the police force will now have the ability and the power to arrest everyone who goes on illegal protests. So it will definitely be spelling an end to the protests in Hong Kong. But otherwise, I'm not sure what exactly it will bring.
Okay, and what do you think this means for activists such as Joshua Wong? Will they become wanted criminals, or will they be allowed to continue normal life in Hong Kong as long as they are allowed to stop protesting?
I think they will be fleeing to other countries realistically. There's been a lot of reports about people leaving Hong Kong, moving to other countries after the passing of this law. I suppose if you're an activist, Hong Kong isn't really the place for you now, since freedom of speech is banned. And if you're an activist, then you will be trying to say quite a lot of radical stuff, and that would make you an easy target of the national security law, I suppose. So if you're an activist, you would be moving to somewhere else where you could continue saying stuff, but yeah, you won't be staying in Hong Kong.
So, Vincent, recently the British government said that they were willing to allow Hong Kongers to claim British citizenship and come and live in Britain. Over 200,000 Hong Kongers are estimated to be expected to come over. What are your views on this? And do you think that many Hong Kong citizens will be seeking asylum in other countries? And if so, why?
Well, it really depends on how serious you think the national security law is. For me, I don't think it's that big of a matter. So yeah, okay, we might not get to say different things freely anymore, but I mean, it's the same. It's the same anywhere. So suppose you move to Britain, what use is there in trying to say something about Hong Kong anymore? So like, if you stay in Hong Kong, or if you move to Britain, you're facing the same scenario. Whereas in Hong Kong, you're forced not to say anything radical, and in Britain, you don't have the need to say anything. So I think it's much of a choice of your personal opinion. But I wouldn't imagine a lot of Hong Kongers leaving Hong Kong since it's their home and it's quite a big decision. I wouldn't imagine there would be a huge flux.
Okay. And how do you think the tourist industry will be affected by this? Sorry, I'll repeat the question. How do you think the tourism industry will be affected by the implementation of these new laws?
Ironically, I think the tourist industry will be affected greater by the protest than by the passing of this new law. So I think if you're someone who's traveling to Hong Kong just looking for a nice holiday, this law wouldn't really affect you that much. What it really affects is the permanent citizens of Hong Kong, because they have to be careful about everything they do, I suppose, if they're an activist. But otherwise, if you're just traveling to Hong Kong, this law may even provide a safer Hong Kong without certain riots. So I'm not saying protests are wrong, but sometimes they can deteriorate into riots, and that can definitely have a most negative effect on tourism. And it's been most clearly visible from the figures. I'm pretty sure that the tourism industry has dropped in Hong Kong since the outbreak of the protests. So once this national security law has been placed, I don't think it will present that much of a of a challenge or an obstacle for anyone who's traveling to Hong Kong, and it might even help revive tourism by ending protests and riots, I suppose.
Do you think parallels can be drawn between the Black Lives Matter protests and the protests going on in Hong Kong?
Well, yes, to some extent, but I think the whole Hong Kong protest is, it's to some extent a hoax by some other foreign powers. So I'm definitely confident that the US has something to do in stirring up this public revolt in Hong Kong. So it's not only a fight for democracy, but I'm pretty sure it's also a political tool by some other countries to meddle up in Chinese affairs and try to create another source of concern for China to try to deal with alongside the US Sino trade war. So the Black Lives Matter is a very pure it's a very pure ideological movement, whereas the Hong Kong movement is very complex and there's a lot of underlying factors, including intervention from foreign powers and stuff like that. So parallels can definitely be drawn, but I think the Hong Kong problem is way more complex as well.
Thank you very much, Vincent and Alexander, for that insightful interview. Now, as I'm sure you're all raring to go, back over to Lily, Mason and Amber.
So the Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing. So it's Amber Heard accusing Johnny Depp of assaulting her, but due to recent evidence from close employees, another opinion is that Amber Heard was the assaulter.
Yeah, I mean, I personally am of the believe survivors mindset. So unless there's evidence to the contrary, I will believe the survivor of sexual assault.
Do you not feel that perhaps the Me Too movement is being capitalised on by those who perhaps want to use it for their own gain to get money, and then perhaps manipulating the system of those believing survivors?
I think that a lot of people bring up the fact that there can be false accusations as a way to kind of shut down or delegitimize the Me Too movement, because really the number of false accusations versus the number of actual rapes, there's not that many false accusations compared to actual rapists. And so many rapists never get caught because women are scared to speak up. So I'm not all too concerned about people trying to capitalize on that. Because also just I don't see a lot of rationale behind choosing to capitalize on sexual assault versus probably 10 billion other things you could try to capitalize on. It's not really a concern of mine. Falsifications, yeah. I'm always believe the survivors unless there's evidence to the contrary.
The believe survivors notion, does that, in your mind, inherently involve an assumption of guilt or innocence?
So in the American system, we say that someone is innocent until proven guilty. But in the case of a sexual assault, I believe that someone is guilty until proven innocent.
That was sort of my takeaway from what you were saying about, believe survivors. Obviously, the vast majority of rape cases and accusations are true, but there's from what I've seen in the United States, the innocent until proven guilty is something that will stay in the system forever. I don't think it's going to be able to change based on what time it is.
Although in the US, don't a few states still have the death penalty?
We do have the death penalty. I think one of the big things about sexual assault cases, because of the statute of limitations in the United States, is really, it's the court of public opinion. I think in the court of public opinion, we need to say guilty until proven innocent. Just because when women come forward, it's not always in a legal setting, because we don't really permit that a lot of the time. If it has been a certain, I don't know the statute of limitations on rape, but I know that there is one. So it's really more about how that person will be treated moving forward. Do they get to keep their job? Is the workplace where that was happening? If so, they should not be keeping their job. Should they be a Supreme Court justice making decisions about women's rights? Probably not. Okay, so this has been so nice talking to you guys. Don't forget to tune in next week.
To our audience, Thank you very much for tuning in this week to Teenagers on Lockdown, the podcast, episode 2. Remember to like and share this video and subscribe to our blog for daily updates. We look forward to seeing you next week for Teenagers on Lockdown, the podcast, episode 3. Teenagers on Lockdown, the podcast, was produced by lockdownblog.org in partnership with TA Music.